The GOP is split over Elbridge Colby's nomination to serve as the Pentagon's undersecretary, prompting Vice President J.D. Vance to step in the crossfire in defense of Colby. So here to break this down for us is Blaze editor-in-chief. No, it's not. No, it's not. Okay, sorry. Well, the GOP is split over Elbridge Colby's nomination to serve as the Pentagon's undersecretary, prompting Vice President J.D. Vance to step in the crossfire in defense of Colby. So here to break this down for us is Chris Bedford. And Bedford, I've seen out there, okay, so we have J.D. Vance jumping in. I saw Don Jr. Writing an op-ed piece. So why is Colby getting some pushback from Republicans?
Well, because Colby's someone who has questioned the blob. I mean, that's just straight up. You see some people trying to call that being Democrat. You see some people trying to call that not being a loyal Republican. If you look back and try to remember in the lead up to the Iraq War, the way that people were treated, if they tried to say, hold on a second, what are we doing here? Maybe this isn't actually foreign policy. And maybe historically, this is not even what a conservative foreign policy would look like, which is, I think, a whole different philosophical argument from the here and now. But Colby is someone who has thought outside the box on a lot of these issues. You know, and J.D. Vance, the vice president, has thought outside the box on a lot of these sorts of issues. I mean, he checks out the content that we put out at the Blaze. He's a confirmed reader of magazines like Compact, where you have people from the left and right coming together and pushing back against some of the foreign policy assumptions that we've always had to deal with from this blob, both Democrats and Republicans. Now, there is a main reason, which is Colby's main thing is that China is the number one threat, and that the United States' nightmare scenario is facing a well-armed and belligerent Russia at the same time as an armed and belligerent China. That would be an extreme danger, in his view, to the United States' security and the ability to actually win those conflicts. And those are his focus. He thinks that most other things get us off that focus, particularly conflicts in the Middle East. There's a huge amount of Republicans, rightly or wrongly, who disagree with that. If you're Senator Tom Cotton, who's a powerful voice for neoconservatives, but someone who has been willing to work with President Trump on a number of issues, one of Colby's very dangerous lines is that the United States could potentially deal with a nuclear-armed Iran, and that containment of a nuclear-armed Iran is preferable to war with Iran. And that's something that's just one of his many papers. He's got decades he's put out there. He's talked about belligerence against Iran, what that would look like, why that might be necessary. But this is a sticking point for Iran hawks like Tom Cotton. Now, they came out and they started to push back, and you started to see on the movement online. And it seems like the Trump White House is trying somewhat of the Pete Hegseth strategy, which is, while J.D. Vance has been very conciliatory and has worked closely on guiding these nominees through and has been willing to help assuage the concerns of senators and set up meetings to make sure these sorts of things happen, they also usually pick a target. That's one of the things that has really worked against the blob and has worked in favor of MAGA on a lot of these certain issues, is they actually say, all right, you're the senator who we're going to pick to be the opponent of Pete Hegseth. Sure, it may have been Mitch McConnell who put you up to it. There's almost certainly a bunch of senators, whether it's Young or Tillis, whoever, who are right behind you, whispering in your ear and ready to join forces. But we're just going to pick one person. It's kind of like a prison yard philosophy of beat up one person on where everyone can see it on your first day and let everyone know not to mess with you. Well, they've got a close relationship with Tom Cotton, but it seems like he may have picked this card. Now, Senator Vance, Vice President Vance didn't go after him, but he went after some of the people who are pushing this, and he went after them hard, saying that Colby is one of the greatest strategic minds he's ever actually met. They're old friends. He calls them Bridge. They go way back, and this is going to be the next fight that we're going to see.
Well, let's go ahead and listen to Colby himself, because he has this crazy idea, Bedford, that foreign policy should be America first. Let's listen.
I travel the world a lot, as you do. And in most other countries, in Korea, they put Korean interests first. In India, they put India's. In Poland, they put Polish interests first. Why should we be any different? And now that doesn't mean that we're going to be, nasty or mean or aggressive or belligerent unnecessarily. In fact, I think in the platform, they talked about the importance of strong alliances, but alliances that work for us, too. Yeah. And I think you mentioned things like the international organizations, the UN, the border, things where, hey, foreign policy is not something that just happens for the benefit of the Beltway establishment, but rather something that should be connected to what the American people actually think is necessary.
Well, Chris, it feels like the America First agenda is just a tidal wave that is running through this country right now.
Yeah, this is a foreign policy that I think it's best just constrained within one sentence from Young Americans for Freedom's old Sharon statement from 1960, which is the foreign policy of the United States should be judged along the following terms: serving the just interests of the United States. Now, those interests should not be unjust. You should not be going about committing evil in the name of the United States. We don't want to be colonial Holland or something here. But you also have to understand that the interests of the United States ought to come first. That is something that has long been forgotten by both the Department of Defense and the Department of State. Something that Donald Trump talked a lot about in his first term in office, when he, for example, went to the Philippines and said, went to Vietnam, and said, this is some very nice U.S. equipment you have. Why do you have it? Well, you gave it to us. Do you buy from us? And they said, no, we buy from China. And he said, then why did we give this to you? This is not in our interests. This isn't, what are we actually doing here? Now, there could be things that could be actually worked out, and with all these different countries. But the first question the policymakers should be asking is, how does this serve the United States? And that's something that, despite being painstakingly obvious, has been forgotten. You'll see people, I've seen, and sometimes the dumber ones will actually say the quiet part out loud. Where you have whole arguments you'd see in the pages of the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, for example, on why the United States should invade this Middle Eastern country. And there'll be 5 reasons. And all of them are usually pretty good reasons for countries like maybe Israel or for countries like Saudi Arabia. And some of the dumber op-eds will even list those other countries and their security interests and why it's important. And now those countries have legitimate security interests. And the countries that we're talking about invading maybe are something that they ought to consider invading. But they so often confuse our interests with those of our even close allies that it needs to stop. And people are afraid when someone actually calls that out.
We cannot emphasize that point enough. Like you say, it's simple, but people need to grasp it. If you don't go for that simple goal, you will fail. And people who have the political will, even if they disagree about how to get there, who actually want to do the thing, are what's coming back to Washington in this administration. Thank God. Speaking of which, let's move to Marco Rubio. Secretary of State Rubio, very interesting trip that he's on right now. Recently, though, he visited the Church of the Holy Sepulchre when he was in Israel. Chris, let's talk about the significance of that visit and that picture that's been circulating of him there.
Oh, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is one of the most sacred sites in all of Christendom. And it's one that's hotly contested amongst Christians. It's divided between 3 different Christian sects, that, including the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. And they really don't like it if you cross over their lines into this church or disrupt their different services that are going on. But it's kind of a symbol of, there's a largely forgotten aspect of the conflict in Israel and around Israel, that despite a huge amount of American Christian support for all the actors in there, people sometimes forget that there are Christians who live there and are on the ground. And they're spread out across the entire area. There are Christians in Syria, and Christians, of course, in Lebanon. There are Christians in Gaza, Catholic churches and Orthodox churches in Gaza. There are Christians, of course, in Jerusalem. And so often you hear these conflicts talked about in such simplistic terms. which is just Israel, America's ally, secular Jewish state, versus the Palestinians and whoever's ruling them at the time. And people often forget about those who are not empowered, those who do not get military grants, those who aren't given Iron Dome or are not given aid, or you don't have left-wing nonprofits pouring in to feed them or protect them or claim that they're somehow being victimized. They're completely forgotten in the mix. So to see a United States, which is largely a Christian country, founded as a Christian country, Secretary of State go over there and say the United States has a real concern to all sides and all parties about the treatment and protection of the one group in this entire region which has no army, no intelligence apparatus, no major groups that really supporting them, is a really welcome sign. And I mean, it is shocking because you never see it. No administration, whether they're pro-Christian, anti-Christian, seems to talk about this forgotten group. And it's just so refreshing to see that from the Secretary of State.
Well, let's move over to the Secretary of Transportation. Sean Duffy and Pete Buttigieg went after each other on X. It was an interesting exchange because Buttigieg was asking, how many FAA personnel were actually fired? Well, Duffy responded in part saying that Mayor Pete failed for 4 years to address the air traffic controller shortage and upgrade our outdated World War II era air traffic control system. He said, you know what? Here's the truth. The FAA alone has a staggering 45,000 employees, and less than 400 were let go, and 0 air traffic controllers and critical safety personnel were let go. But Mayor Pete chose this amazing department, and he wanted to have this that's so critical to America's success as a slush fund for the Green New Scam and environmental justice nonsense. So when you see this WWE fight, Bedford, what do you make of this one between Duffy and Buttigieg?
I can't believe how much Peter screwed up at the Department of Transportation. I mean, that's kind of supposed to be a posh political post. One that doesn't, you're not going to have to fight a war. You're not going to have to make peace in the Middle East. You're not in charge of America's nukes. But you are, it turns out, in charge of an infrastructure which everyone knows and has known for a long time is aging and decrepit and on its way out. And he did nothing to improve it. From his day one, he sat through disaster after disaster, whether it was a train literally exploding a town in the vice president's home state, or whether it was air traffic controllers and near misses, whether it was backups and the actual ability for us to bring cargo ships into the United States and actually unload their cargo. And he failed at every single one. He literally was working from home like some kind of Zoomer, playing mommy with little Instagram things with him home with the child that they adopted. It's completely embarrassing. He didn't do the job. For him to come back out and say this is wild. And at the same time, the Blaze did a great documentary on this, the next disaster, the next aviation disaster, because every bit of this was predictable. This is not like a freak storm that just comes out of nowhere. And how are we possibly going to deal with this? This has been building. And it's so important for people to recognize that so much of American decline is not because of some force of God outside of our control. It is the conscious decision mixed with neglect, mixed with active harm by people and departments that work in concert to undermine us and to put priorities which are far from actual aviation safety before aviation safety.
Amen. There's probably no greater symbol of the failure of the professional managerial class than Mr. Buttigieg, complete failure. We have something fun to talk about, though, in the last 60 seconds here or so. I'm going to give you a world historical layup. I'm just going to put it in Chris Bedford's lap because, as you may have heard, the 2025 Principles First Summit is coming up. And its attendees include Mark Cuban, Chris Christie, Adam Kinzinger, and our own favorite here at Blaze, Harry Dunn, the disgraced Capitol Hill cop. So you want to explain to people what this summit is using at least PG-related language?
It's such a collection of low-T has-beens and scoldy schoolmarms. It is unbelievable. It's like a cartoon lineup. It's if I had to make a lineup of 100 people or 25 people who I don't want to see and don't want to hear what they say. and never really want to hear from them ever again. And you got to wonder whose tail is wagging to buy these tickets. I guarantee you that your signal thread or your chat message thread with your friends from college or high school is significantly more interesting than anything that any of these people have to say. And it's such a self-pleasuring exercise, maybe done in a circle, from these folks to actually get together and pat each other in the back and claim that they put principles first, when so clearly they've put their careerism first. These people aren't suffering. They make money. I mean, it's the people out there who are actually fighting for principled stances, who are actually taking the hits. These guys just sit there and they pat themselves in the back and they go all the way to the bank, and their house in McLean is not threatened. And, you know, I applaud them for putting together such a Burger King Kids Club of unimpressive people.
You can have it your way, Bedford. It's fine. You know what, Mr. Editor-in-Chief? We send Julio Rosas out to protests all the time. Maybe we have to send him to this. I mean, this might be too good to pass up.
Probably is more dangerous than the protests in some ways, and it certainly is a flaming pile of riotous garbage. So, I mean, it would be...
I might get an appletini thrown in my face.
Yeah.
It would be fun to actually send Julio. That's not a bad idea.